Deputy Director in International Relations. For those who, if you are familiar with WUN, you might know what it is right now, but for ones who may not know yet, WUN is a leading global network of 24 prestigious universities spread across the 6 continents. Their mission is to foster international collaboration in higher education and research, and we are thrilled to have their backing for this initiative. So this webinar series will be a fantastic platform for everyone to exchange their research and experiences from your background from around the world. And without further ado, I will pass the stage to Dr. Sumitra, to the PI for this project. So thank you once again and welcome everyone to this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nantamon. Let me give a brief introduction about this project first. So this project is supported by Worldwide Universities Network, and the title is Reducing Indigenous Inequalities, Contextualizing Strategies and Policies for Achieving Community Empowerment in Different Global Regions. And the objective of this webinar is, of course, to provide a platform for scholars from different parts of the world to share their research experience. And so it's our aim to examine and compare revitalization approaches and strategies used to empower communities, and also for policy making and implementation, as well as context-based challenges and solutions. And once again, the project is supported by Worldwide University Network, Understanding Culture Global Challenge Steering Group. And we have members from SOAS, who is our Professor Julia, the first speaker today. She is from SOAS University of London. And we also have members from University of Alberta, University of Cape Town, University of Leeds, University of Sheffield, Maastricht University, and of course Mahidol University's different departments, and Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Mayo Universities, and Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages, University of Lucknow, and Warsaw University. Okay. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to our very first speaker, Professor Julia Samabang, who is an expert in language revitalization as well as language policy. So everybody, please welcome Professor Julia.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now so you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Just a moment. Share screen.
Can you share?
Yes, I think that's okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Wait, I will now go to slideshow mode. Okay, and put this more. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this talk. Good morning, Sawasdee Ka. I'm very pleased to see so many people here. I want to talk a little bit, sort of distilling everything I found really over the past 20 years of my research. But first of all, I would like to, oh dear, my slide's not working. There we go. I would like to just pause a moment to remember Professor Sule Premsrirat, our kind mentor who sadly passed away last week, who was devoted to improving the educational outcomes of minority children in Thailand. She was a tower of strength and a beacon of inspiration, and particularly to me, a shining example of kindness. She was the one who initiated the collaboration between our universities. And so I think it's thanks to her that we are meeting here today, and that I've done so much good work since then in collaboration with Dr. Sumitra, who I've been collaborating with now for the last 9 or 10 years. And this talk is of course dedicated to Professor Suilai. So I would ask, please, can I ask, I keep getting messages about people in the waiting room. Please, can our organisers deal with letting them in? Thank you very much. So first of all, I want to, I think I can hide this. Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit first about language endangerment, which is kind of taken as a given when you talk about language revitalization. It's basically a response to language endangerment. And we know that many languages around the world, or this is perhaps a discourse that we hear, that many languages are at risk of no longer being used as their speakers shift to another language. And the fact that speakers are shifting to another language is often given as a cause of language endangerment, but actually, of course, it's only a symptom because there are other reasons why people are shifting to another language. There are reasons why people don't pass their heritage language onto their children. So I think we need to look at the causes of language endangerment and also at possible solutions. We know that back in 1992, Michael Krauss estimated that about 90% of the world's languages spoken at that time will die out before 2100 if the current trends continue. At that time, it was estimated that there were about 6,000 languages in the world. And other people, such as Crystal, estimated that only 50% would die out. And this is still, of course, of great concern to linguists and also to the communities who speak them. However, I think it's kind of paradoxical that if you look at the counts of languages by organizations such as Ethnologue, and there's also other organizations, there's a new map from UNESCO as well of languages around the world. Ethnologue this year found 7,168 languages, which is up from by about 100 since last year, well, in the last few years. And as I mentioned, we only thought that there were about 6,000 in the 1990s. So I think we have to we have to problematize how we count languages, how we define languages, and also what we define as language vitality. But that is not the topic of this talk. It's just something I want to mention and put to one side for a moment. Because the main thing I want to talk about is how we approach language endangerment in terms of how we might find solutions to it. And I think there's a contrast between how linguists, who are basically scientists, if you like, linguistic scientists, focus on the numbers, on scales of vitality, comparisons, if you like, big comparisons, language typology of language endangerment. There's a contrast between that and the focus of community members on the impact on their lives. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Inspired by Lisa O'Brien and Peter Austin, who is here today as well, talking about that a few years ago. As I said earlier, there's not a huge amount, I think, that's absolutely new in this talk, but what I'm trying to do is put together things that I've noticed over the years and sort of thinking about everything I've learned in the last 20 years or so. So the response to language endangerment, Suzanne Romain, again, it's a few years ago now, about 16 years ago, pointed out that there are differences in the responses between various actors in the field, let's say. So the response of many governments is simply to do nothing. And many people who don't worry about language endangerment and don't worry about linguistic diversity, say, oh, well, this is just natural selection. Languages have always grown and died, and this is just a natural process. And governments think, oh, well, if we just kind of leave it, then it won't be a problem anymore because those languages will all have gone. And that means for the linguists, of course, that loss of linguistic diversity will continue. So the response of academia has been mainly to document languages, to record, to analyze, to put them in archives for linguistic science, really. So the aim here is to make sure that we have a record of how the many different ways that people can speak, the many different shapes and forms that languages can take before it's too late to find that out. And Michael Krauss, one of the things that he said in his famous paper in 1992 was, will linguistics be the subject that presided over the disappearance of 90% of its subject matter? So very much the focus on that was the effect on linguistic science as a field. But of course, the people who are actually really impacted by this are the communities who use those languages, or not, as the case may be, because they're shifting to other languages. And their main response has been to promote language maintenance and language revitalization. And this has been going on a lot longer than the linguists have been really worried about it. So people have been trying to revitalize languages, mainly since the 1970s, 1980s. This started really taking off in a big way. And we have to remember that it's not just about language. I'll come back to that later. People make links with other aspects of their lives as well, and particularly with their culture. In many cases, the people that I've talked to around the world, people are actually more worried about the loss of their culture than they are about the loss of their language. So we try to make links between the two as linguists, because we're worried about language. And I think that language revitalization is increasingly popular. You see more and more examples of it, and particularly in Asia, I have to say. But in the academic community, it's often seen by linguists as unscientific practice. And please, can we mute everybody? So language revitalization as a field is seen as more sociological, anthropological. And in linguistics, often some of my colleagues will say that linguistic theory, how languages work, is the only kind of theory there is. But I have really been trying very hard to promote the field of language revitalization as a valid field of study in its own right. Okay. So I'm just going to remove this from the, right, okay. Okay, so trying to make this work. Okay, so yes, so we know that there are reasons for language endangerment, language loss. I'm sorry, excuse me, organizers, you need to set the settings so that people who enter are muted automatically. National colonial and post-colonial language policies have resulted in many minoritized people feeling a loss of self-worth and pride. And I think this is one of the key impacts of language endangerment, language shift. It comes because of partly deliberate in some cases, and partly just thoughtless suppression of local cultures by national governments, by more dominant cultures. And so in such cases, people shift language in order to escape marginalization, to give a better life to their children. And this is often when they start to see escape routes, if you like. Because having a low status language is not in its own, or just on in itself, a reason for language shift. In many cases, you've got diglossic situations where languages coexist in a linguistic ecosystem, and for many hundreds of years, and but yet are not endangered. But once people start to see that that they can escape poverty, for example, that speaking a larger language might give their children better chances in life, then people may start to shift language. And this is something that's happening all the way around the world. But I think people are also realizing that it's not necessarily the answer to marginalization. We've also seen that colonial powers such as the UK have practiced such practices on what they call home minorities. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, where I live, Celtic languages have been minoritized for many hundreds of years, and this has been a strategy that has then been exported into the colonies, and also the kind of educational policies as well. And so I think we can try to turn that round and say that reclaiming one's language then becomes an important means towards combating colonial and post-colonial legacies. And increasingly around the world, people are seeing language revitalization, language reclamation as a way of regaining empowerment. Okay. So we can then see revitalization and reclaiming languages as just part of a larger process of decolonization, of cultural reappropriation, and reclaiming communities' right to determine their own fate. And in this way, there are parallels with other types of cultural shift and restitution. I'm just going to show you a few examples of language revitalization around the world. There are many, many more than this. These are a few that I have had contact with, mostly in one way or another. So in many of these cases, I know people who are involved in revitalization of these languages. The one up on the left-hand corner, Genesia here, is my own heritage language. It was the impetus for me to get involved in this field. Okay, so you can see that there are examples of language revitalization in all parts of the world. As I said, I think there is particularly increasing interest in Asia at the moment. And by the way, this map is deliberately focused on the Pacific because some of the oldest original, some of the best known examples of language revitalization are in the Pacific, particularly Hawaii and New Zealand, the Maori language. And these have been often some of the kind of examples of language revitalization that have been copied in many places around the world. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've been thinking a lot about what I've learned over the last 20 years or so. And so I'm troubling with the PowerPoint slides here. As I mentioned, in principle, language revitalization should be a decolonizing project because it aims to empower minoritized communities because we can reclaim subjugated language, subjugated cultures. But I think in many cases, language activists and linguists also are influenced by the same ingrained language ideologies that informed colonialist policies and practices. And this is not really surprising because this is the context in which we have been brought up and educated. So what that means is that when we think about language revitalization activities, we may copy the hegemonic models, the models that are ingrained into our consciousness about how we teach languages, how we go about language revitalization. So, for example, these essentialist ideas that link language, culture, thought, identity intrinsically, are pretty much well, they're pretty much universal in language revitalization. We can use this quite strategically. I think often it's quite useful to argue that language and identity are closely bound. This is often a strategy that we use very much in publicizing language revitalization. But sometimes our rhetoric in this is too successful. And we start to believe it ourselves. And that can also mean that we focus very much on what is called authenticity, about traditions, about how people did things in the olden days, and particularly linguists and many community members are interested in how language was spoken before contact and like to focus on that. But really what language revitalization is about taking languages into the future, and we really need to make them attractive to young people as well. We often find a lot of exoticization, folklorization. I'll give you some examples of that. So that endangered languages are seen as something which is other. They are othered. They are seen as, we see the colorful people dancing. Yeah. Okay. Also, sometimes endangered language movements can be exclusive. They can exclude people who are not from a particular ethnicity or sometimes who are not from a particular age group. Also, if we focus on traditional values, traditional social values, that can actually exclude a lot of people who are, let's say, less traditional in their thoughts and ways of life. I think it's really important to also to make common cause to people who are suffering from other kinds of oppression, which also have similar causes to language endangerment. Okay. And of course, in many cases, language revitalization movements rely on formal education as really the only way they approach language revitalization. And very often people deny that language change is happening, or they often younger people who learn minoritized languages. And we know as linguists that language change happens, and language change is actually life in language. If a language doesn't change, then it really is dead. But many people seem to think that we ought to go back, as I said, to speaking how our grandfathers or even hundreds of years ago people spoke our languages, which doesn't really make it very useful for living in the modern day. And really we need to make our languages more valid in the modern day and age. Okay, so I think one of the challenges that I'm looking at is how do we reveal such discourses and ideologies and assumptions, and how do we try to challenge them? How do we raise awareness of them? And I think, and also, of course, from my point of view, as an external researcher in most of the cases I've been talking about, what is our role? Do we have a role in language revitalization and in decolonization? Okay, I just have to change that. Okay, so when I was researching this talk, when I was preparing this talk, I did a bit of a search on Google for images of endangered language revitalization, and this is the first one that I found. It's from a blog, an online magazine, International Affairs Review, almost a year ago now. And it is actually not about language, because what you often find, this is a Mari haka, it's a traditional war dance, and often these things are performed for tourists. Many of the people who are involved in such dances don't necessarily actually speak the language. So this is perhaps about cultural reclamation, about cultural revitalization. But we can't necessarily say that it's actually about language revitalization. And I would say that this is a fairly exoticized image of what someone in a magazine has imagined as language revitalization. Okay. So the second image I found was from the Linguistic Society of America website, who I think really ought to know better, actually. So this is actually not about language revitalization. This is language documentation happening. Here is a white linguist who is in the foreground, the foregrounded person, writing down something that she's eliciting from some brown people who are in the background, and none of these people are named. And in many cases, so this when you see this kind of image, they don't even name the language that's being talked about. If you look carefully in the middle, you can see a recording device and a microphone. And it's possible that this image was posed for this particular purposes, because I know from experience that often what is shown, what is seen, is not necessarily what actually happens. Okay, but what we can see here is that the focus here is on the white linguist and also on the white linguist agenda. Okay. I thought, and I've just added this one, actually. This is something that has come up in the last week, a news flash from the Indonesian Ministry of Education declaring 11 indigenous languages extinct. Now, Indonesia has been known as the second most linguistically diverse country in the world. And if interestingly, this image is about a fisherman's wife, being it's not only racist, it's sexist as well, carrying a squid bait. So it's not actually about language at all, but it may be about culture, but it's actually about learning a living, perhaps. But I thought it was very interesting what Gerald Roach has posted on social media, commenting on this particular paper, saying that it's a masterclass in how not to say colonialism, because what the article says is that they've gone extinct due to the absence of speakers passing them on to successive generations. Now, as I said earlier, that is not a cause of language shift. That is actually the process of language shift. That is what happened. That is the effect of language shift, that people don't pass the language on to their children. The article also says, or the Ministry of Education also said, or the Ministry of Education also says that it's because there are many languages with small populations. For hundreds and thousands of years, that has not been a cause of language shift. You can go on speaking your language really with a very small population in a very stable way. And then, of course, it does mention intermarriage, modernization, whatever they mean by that. English, blaming English rather than, for example, the national language, migration, and the demands of a globalized world. So in none of these, they don't actually lay any blame in any corner, and that may be for political purposes, but I think what we really need to do in this field is to grasp the nettle, to actually face head on unpleasant things like, you know, what actually happens when people and languages are marginalized. Okay. So I'm going to look a little bit at the history of colonialism in linguistics, because there has been a lot of colonial thinking in the field of linguistics. Susan Irvin has pointed this out. And particularly, she says the conditions in which linguists carried out their research was often in concert with the colonizing powers, and also with missionaries who also kind of went out in the wake of colonizers. Influenced the description of African, and not just African, linguistic structures around the world, and the delimitation of linguistic boundaries. So in many cases, the names of languages and the kind of boundaries between languages are pretty much artificial. They have grown up because of accidents of history or colonial history, in fact. Okay. And it has been assumed, for example, this essentialist assumption that languages correspond to ethnic groups has often gone unopposed, and also because colonialism is propagated by countries which promote a monolingual mindset. This monolingual mindset has then been exported as well, so that multilingualism is seen as an aberration, when in fact most people around the world are multilingual. Okay. And so Lee Stobrin has pointed out that then these kind of interpretations by linguists then sort of naturalize social hierarchies, so that then we impose not simply a mosaic of languages and intersecting languages and multilingual practices, but it was then the European nationalist model of language, and particular language policy was imposed, so that when newly in the 1960s, for example, newly independent nations were deciding on language policies, they followed European language policies in terms of promoting one national language, one national unity, for example. So Mulhoist always pointed out that the identification of languages and the way they're named are far from being an act of objective description, and actually may constitute a serious violation of the linguistic ecology of a given area. Okay, so this is still happening because still linguists assume that languages are bounded objects and kind of exist in sort of in space naturally. And what is more, that we have the right to capture or document them and to describe them and to delimit them. And yeah, we assume that as academic researchers, we have the right to do this. Okay. As I mentioned, there is this monolingual mindset that people have one mother tongue, one national language, and that multilingualism, and particularly code mixing, code switching, are aberrations which should perhaps be wiped out, or particularly code mixing. That's the worst thing to do. And people think of languages in kind of hierarchical ecologies rather than repertoires, rather than, as I said, a kind of intersected mosaic of ways of speaking. And when we carry out linguistics, we assume that it's the Western style knowledge which should trickle down to local researchers. So when linguists employ local assistants, is often not on an equal basis. And when we talk about knowledge transfer, and transferable skills, what we're doing is training people to transcribe and translate data. And transcription is as we know, probably the most boring and quite onerous part of linguistic work. And we farm that out to local people who are the experts in their language, but their expertise is not really recognized in terms of, for example, the amount they pay them. Okay, and of course, when we published our research, we mainly publish it in English in Western-owned journals, and this has impacted our host university, Mahidol, so that Sumitra and I are currently organizing a series of writing workshops because people in Mahidol University and other universities around the world are finding that they have to publish in high-impact Western-owned journals in order to get jobs or keep their jobs. And once we do manage to publish in these highly sought-after journals, we then find that the writing, what we publish is behind paywalls, so that the people we're writing about, the people whose languages are writing about, the people whose data we have taken to make our living, is behind a paywall, so they can't actually access it. So they can only access it through us, through universities. And so really universities are writing by and for each other. Okay, so I'm just going to recap something that was again noticed back in the 1990s and extended by Colette Grunewald in the 2000s, in the early 21st century. They have identified a progression in the way that linguists from the West, if you like, from major universities approach field work with minoritized people. This is not working again. One moment. Okay, so the original approach to fieldwork is that you do work on a language. Many of us have experience of being taught to elicit particular language paradigms, for example, treating languages and by extension the communities who speak those languages as objects of study, whose value was really only as examples of linguistic paradigm, not as people in their own right. And the outcomes of such kind of studies are academic papers. There isn't really anything given back to the community, and that is the traditional model of linguistic fieldwork. And then this developed in the 1960s, which was the period of civil rights movement and also an advocacy in many other ways. People developed the paradigm of doing field work for a language community. So the idea was that people like us would give something back to the community. William Labov was one of the first people to advocate this point of view, particularly with his work with speakers of African American vernacular English in America. So for example, he appeared in court to support their claim that their language was quite separate from English and therefore merited mother tongue education. Okay, so in this case, people are not just seen as sources of data, and we also recognize that political and economic problems contribute to language shift. So you can see the paradigm shifting to a more, if you like, humanistic approach to fieldwork. So from then, the progression, this was the last progression that Cameron et al. Identified, was doing fieldwork with language communities, which developed in the 1980s with participatory action research, which and my colleague Sumitra is a prime example of doing this kind of research. So doing collaborative research with people from the community who are fully involved in deciding and looking and deciding what to research, for example. Which then develops further from that, when people from communities actually get enough agency and money, I have to say, to be interested in language documentation, language revitalization themselves, they may get involved. And this is particularly the case in places like North America, Australia, where it is possible for communities to get funding, to get control of their own land, of their own education systems. And in places where, for example, there may be autonomy and education in local languages, and where people are able to be in control of the curriculum as well. And in these cases, the field work, the research is on the community's on the community's terms. So the role of the external linguist is capacity building and support for the community rather than deciding on the actual agenda. And these approaches may be multidisciplinary, and I've been involved in projects where linguists have collaborated with ethnobotanists, ecologists, musicologists, and many other fields, depending on what local people are interested in. Okay, and a key part of such programs, which wasn't necessarily the case with previous approaches, is that they focus very much on language revitalization, language maintenance, particularly creating language teaching programs with all the problems that may entail, of course, which I'll come back to later. Okay, and as I said, in this case, external researchers should be seen as resources rather than the people who set the agenda. They are engaged by a community to do a job which is decided by them. Okay, but the problem with that is that it may not fit with the dominant funding models, which are often still what is called the lone wolf sort of traditional model of language of field work, where a linguist goes out somewhere exotic and conducts field work on a language. And I have to say that all of these models are still alive and well, and we probably know people, probably ourselves as well, have people who are carrying out this kind of research. So I'm not saying that the progression is yet over. These are different approaches which are all still quite valid. Okay, and of course, people like me, quite embarrassingly, are then asked to give lectures in places like India, Pakistan, and Thailand on decolonization. And this is why I feel a bit of a fraud in some way. I was saying to a colleague earlier that I feel a bit of imposter syndrome here, because who am I to tell people like you about decolonization? Because I only have a very minor experience of being on the receiving end of that, only because my own community has experienced language loss as well, and also through collaborating, of course, with other people. But still, people keep asking me. Okay, so welcome to the International Decade of Endangered Languages. This was announced by UNESCO in 2020 after what they deemed was a very successful international year of Indigenous languages in 2019. And the focus in this International Decade of Indigenous Languages is very much on revitalization of languages, the preservation as well, and also support and also language rights for Indigenous communities. So the aim is very very progressive, very helpful. But still, I think we are getting the kinds of ideologies surfacing which I'm a bit worried about. For example, so you see these colourful people here. We are not told who they are. We are not told, we're hardly ever told their names. It would be rather nice, just to demonstrate that they have given permission for the photograph to be taken. We often even not even told, as I mentioned earlier, which ethnic group they come from, which language they speak. But as I said earlier, being from a particular ethnic group and wearing a particular costume, which they probably don't do every day, is not necessarily linked to speaking or even learning a particular language. So we really had to be careful about the kind of images that we're promoting, I think, about language revitalization. Okay. Okay. This is a film that was released, I think, in 2020. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's got a rather nice website. It is a very, very beautiful film, I have to say, and it's won quite a lot of awards. And you can see all these logos along the bottom, support from the British Museum, or a Sundance Festival is very prestigious associations. Actually, what's interesting is most of these prestigious associations are of kind of Western cultural institutions. The problem that I have with this film is that, as I said said previously, it kind of represents the sort of exoticization, I think, of endangered languages. It shows it uses some of the recordings from the Endangered Languages Archive, and gives the voices of some endangered language speakers, but it doesn't necessarily actually give the voice to endangered language speakers, which is there is a subtle difference there, but using people's voices versus giving voice to people. And I think what we need to do is to give or allow people. It's very difficult to say these things without seeming to be patronizing. So people enable people to take their voices, to reclaim their voices, if you like, in endangered languages. Okay. Here's another example. This is from a blog called Rising Voices, which is actually really good. And actually, this example is really good. So, you know, don't assume that because you've got a heading such as Museums of the Mind, very often headlines are not written by the person who wrote the original article, particularly in newspapers. So we need to bear that in mind. But the heading is often what sticks in the brain, because it is written with the aim of being memorable, of being noticed. So Museums of the Mind, you know, is quite a nice phrase because we've got the repeated sound. And so, you know, it's what this headline does is to say, is kind of imply that the endangered languages are something to be put in museums, therefore something that is static and something of the past. And we have to really, really be careful, I think, with the language that we used, because I think what reclaiming endangered languages is about is taking them into the future rather than putting them in museums. Okay. So let's try to hide this. Wesley Leonard is a researcher that I've got a lot of time for. He is an indigenous researcher from the Miami group of people in North America, and he wrote a very interesting piece on the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which, as I said, is basically being continued into the Decade of Indigenous Languages. So there's a bit of text here, so I've highlighted the bits I think are relevant. So yes, they say that it's really important to record and reclaim traditional knowledge systems, because these are increasingly being recognized as strategic resources for good governance, peace building and reconciliation, and of course sustainable development, which is something I know that is happening in Thailand. What Wesley Leonard points out is that this should be self-evident, and it's only through things like racism and settler colonialism that people have come to assume otherwise. You know, why is it that endangered languages are associated with things of the past, with outmoded things, when actually they are really, really important. The knowledge encapsulated in endangered languages is really important for taking our whole society into the future. Okay. And of course, what is often missing from here is any kind of admission of guilt, like I mentioned with regard to the news item from the Indonesian government. No blame is attached. Also, how community when Indigenous knowledge is captured, if you like, by researchers from dominant groups, it is assumed that they can exploit them for the benefit of the majority. And this, as Leonard says, underscores the common pattern of describing Indigenous languages through non-Indigenous value system, through an academic lens, if you like, yeah, through a colonial lens. And as mentioned in the recent news item about Indonesia, so languages just disappear on their off without any kind of particular reason. It erases the presence of contemporary Indigenous peoples, which is something that Native people in North America often complain about. They're seen as having disappeared, of not being there anymore. We are still here, they say. And as Leonard says, the unaccusative verb to describe language shift is further problematic because it omits the agent. Who, well, why is this happening? And no blame is attached, as I mentioned. He also focuses on the discourse of loss and the enumerations of speakerhood. We talk very often when I talk about a particular language, when I talk about my language, I'm asked, how many speakers does it have? And you really have to think about, well, who do you count as a speaker? How good do you have to be? Do you have to be a native speaker speaking from your childhood through natural intergenerational transmission, when actually many people who are some of the most active people involved in language revitalization are people who want to reclaim languages they did not, which were not passed on to them by their parents, by their grandparents. It's often the generation after the break in language transmission, which turns around and says, what have we lost? What we need to reclaim our right to speak the languages that were not passed on to us because of colonial language policies. Right. Next page. Right. Okay, so I think it's really important to raise awareness of language ideologies. And I just want to spend a little time discussing, just kind of underscoring what we mean by language ideologies, which can be understood as group norms and values, which are often seen as common sense. So they're widely shared ideas, pattern beliefs, guiding norms and values, and ideals accepted as truth by a particular group of people. So as this is what's the problem with the way we've been educated to think in a particular way, basically. So we assume that that linguistic hegemonies, linguistic hierarchies are natural, which can lead to people having very negative attitudes towards their own language, what Labov called even linguistic self-hatred. And this is one of the reasons why people say, oh, well, we have to learn a more useful language because our language is useless. It's holding us back. So we are also, when we think about language revitalization, as I mentioned, a discourse that I hear very often is that we have to get our languages into the schools and that this will lead to resumption of intergenerational transmission. Unfortunately, we know from experience over the last 30 years or so that children who learn a language at school do not necessarily go on and speak it to their own children. And there are various reasons for that. That's probably another whole lecture's worth. But the problem is, as I said, the mismatch then between what we do for language revitalization and desired outcomes, because we haven't engaged in what is called ideological clarification, thinking really hard about what we want, where we want to be and how we're going to get there. Okay, yeah, I mentioned that already. And so therefore, I think it's vital to challenge things like association of Indigenous languages with poverty and powerlessness, because this is what we've been taught. Actually, our languages and our cultures are a source of empowerment if we want to let them be that. Okay, so I think the problem is how to carry that out, because if you go along, go and tell people, oh, well, you're doing it all wrong, then you don't get a very good reaction. This is actually the comment I had from a language activist in Guernsey, is they're going to come in and tell us we're doing it all wrong. And I thought, yes, well, yes, but I didn't say anything because I have found it in my experience, when I started doing research, when I was a PhD student, for a long time, I felt I didn't want to criticize anybody who was involved in language work because they get enough criticism from people who don't want to save minority languages, who don't want to empower minority language speakers. But over the years, I've come to realize that I do have to say something, because if I don't, then it's not going to work. That the language revitalization is going to be a failure if we don't start thinking about the ideologies that drive what we're doing. Okay. Okay, so there are also, as well as ideologies that are held by linguists and by academia, there are also ideologies often held by language communities. And these are generalizations, or they're examples from particular contexts that I've gathered. I'm not saying that all of these ideologies are held by all language communities, and in some cases they are also contradictory, of course, because it's also quite possible to believe 6 contradictory things before breakfast, of course. So this is a very common ideology, that our language is not useful, and also it was holding us back. And also that we have to give up our language to learn a more useful language properly. This is something that, as linguists, I think we're very bad at saying, that multilingualism is a good thing, that it is perfectly possible to learn and speak several languages fluently, and to maintain your home language and learn a more useful, more academic language, for example. Yeah. So you can live in 2 worlds, quite possibly. Yeah. Another common ideology held both by linguists and by language communities is that elders speak the purest version of the language, and are therefore often seen as the only source of linguistic authority. That's a kind of syllogistic jump, if you like. But very often, I mean, rightly we give a lot of respect to elders, but in many cases, actually, they are forgetting their first language, and often find it difficult to especially if you're trying to elicit a language. What you often find is you ask somebody, how do you say this, and they will actually give you what they think is a more prestigious form, rather than what they actually normally speak at the naturally. Okay. It's often thought, therefore, that language change reflects decline, or sometimes it isn't happening, because I've heard people say things like, we speak just like our grandparents. So that's a different one from the next point. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to recognize that language change is happening, and that it actually is a healthy thing for languages. Okay. It's often, as I mentioned, also assumed that there is a very strong relationship between identity and language. And Albury, who was a researcher from New Zealand, a Maori researcher, who has pointed out that this is probably a European way of thinking rather than necessarily an indigenous thinking. This goes back to the assumption that language and ethnicity are somehow linked. Okay. Another trope, another kind of discourse I've often heard from speakers of minority languages: our language is so difficult to learn. This is often because they haven't actually got an experience of anybody learning it as a second language. So therefore, when people try to start reclaiming their language as people who have not had the language passed on to them, then we come to a lot of barriers and a lot of resistance, because it's felt that it's so difficult to learn the language. And often, of course, there are no materials to help us to do that either. And in some cases, cultural knowledge and language use are restricted to members of a particular ethnic group, are also sometimes members of a particular gender. And this is often related to traditional ways of thinking. And it's good to recognize traditional ways of thinking, but sometimes at the same time, we also have to think about the future as well. Okay, because if we restrict use of our languages, then they're not going to continue. Okay, and Leonard has pointed out that if we assume that traditional language contains traditional values, which can include perceived, maybe not even original, but actually just perceived traditional gender roles, then of course that can also have impacts on people's lives in other ways as well. Okay, so there are a few other examples as well. As I mentioned, a very common rhetoric is we've got to get our languages into the school. Joshua Fishman, who many of you know is a key figure in language revitalization thinking, always said that the most important thing is to focus on intergenerational transmission and use in the community, in everyday life, rather, and he said you have to get that established before you can think about literacy and formal learning. But actually, as Romain has pointed out, most language revitalization programs jump straight in for schools, often without adequate teacher training, often without actually thinking about the kind of language that they're teaching, and then kind of turning minoritized languages into like smaller versions of the model of how they think a language works, because they think a language has to have all the things that majority languages have. Okay. So that includes the prioritization of written or prestige forms, so that we think the standardization is essential, that we think, and therefore, as a concomitant of that, we tend to think then that non-standard varieties of a language are less valid, which can in some cases lead to a particular version of a language, a standard unified form being taught in schools, and then the children can't necessarily talk to their grandparents, their great-grandparents who speak a local dialect, which is seen as less valid than the school version. And here we are reproducing hegemonic ideologies of language. Okay. At the same time, Bielenberg has pointed out that mainstream school systems, literacies may be considered alien to some indigenous cultures, but still people are buying into the idea that you have to have school formal type learning rather than traditional forms of learning, perhaps. Okay. Another common thought is we need external experts to save our languages, which is why Indigenous groups often engage linguists if they get control of the research paradigm. We have to have language documentation. We have to have language analysis to save our languages. And also very often language revitalization is based on performance. People assume that giving a recitation, performing, having a language day once a year, performing a school play in your language, this is going to save your language. I think it also leads to exoticization, because then you dress up in so-called traditional costume, and you don't think about language as something that you should and could use every day in your everyday life. Okay, another common trope is our language is dying and that we're powerless to stop it, when actually what we need to do is take the power, reclaim the power to have control over our own lives and our own ways of speaking. Okay, and often, of course, there's reliance on technical things. So many people think, oh, we need an app for that, when actually, as was pointed out by Downhauer and Downhauer back in 1998, this is kind of passing the buck, if you like. Is saying, I've talked to so many people who say things like, oh, I don't have the confidence in my language skills to speak the language in my everyday life, to speak the language to my children. And these are people who often they will teach the language in a school in a fairly formal, controlled environment where they feel that they have control, so they don't have to think, they don't have to extemporize, they don't have to think of things from scratch in the language. But when someone told me that, I thought, well, if you don't have the confidence to speak the language with your family, really, who do you have the confidence to speak with? Okay, so I think that all of these ways of thinking remove the agency from community members, when really language revitalization should be about empowering people from that language community. Okay, so just a few pictures, because we've had a lot of writing for a while. About a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, Nigeria announced a wonderful new language policy that every child was going to be taught through their own home language. Now, Nigeria has at least 450, some people think over 500, and not being counted properly, well, say, accounts of the languages of Nigeria very often disagree. So they made the teaching of indigenous languages compulsory in primary schools. And here you have a picture of a pretty teacher-fronted, it may be posed, of course, this just because you see a picture doesn't mean this is actually what happens in the real classroom. Here we have some very attentive children and a teacher who is using a microphone, which is, I think, not necessary in such a small classroom. But anyway, so this is what makes me think this is not necessarily what happens in real life. But it is a very teacher-fronted notion of how to teach. And it's not necessarily showing teaching, and this is taken from a newspaper article about this announcement. But what the problem is, a year later, that we have not seen any indication of any actual planning, any actual provision to provide resources to implement this language policy. So actually, you know, you can have a lot of rhetoric about how wonderful it is to have mother tongue education without actually a lot of help to actually implement that. Again, Hawaii, this is one of the original language nests. Well, not original one, because this was taken about 10 years ago, this picture. And there are many, many good things about Hawaiian language revitalization, of course. It is one of the movement that is seen as particularly successful. But I am slightly worried that it is very much school-based. There is not a huge amount of evidence of use of the language outside schools. There's not a lot of language in the linguistic landscape. So, you know, I think, you know, this is great. And you can also see that it's not necessarily just children from a particular ethnicity who are involved in language revitalization. We have to remember, of course, that kids of this age did not choose themselves to learn the language. They have been sent by their parents. And in some cases, parents do this instead of learning the language themselves. Although, of course, in other cases, parents do also learn the language to support their children, which is great. But I think relying on the school system can lead to problems, and we need to beware of only putting all our eggs in one basket, particularly in the formal education basket. Okay. And one ideology that has become very successful in propaganda, if you like, to raise awareness of language endangerment is this notion that when a language dies, a way of seeing, feeling, and thinking the world also disappears. And when you talk to people whose families have undergone language shift, you have to be careful when you say, oh, well, when you lose your language, you lose your identity or ethnicity. And they say, well, I've still got an identity. I still feel very much a member of my ethnic group. I just don't speak the language. I would like to speak the language. But people can still see, feel, and think. And people can still translate fairly successfully. We do this all the time, and of course most people are multilingual, and this is again an example of a monolingual ideology of language, where we assume that one language is the source of all our thought, when actually we can think the same thing in many languages. So we had to be careful about propagating ideas which can easily be knocked down in a logical manner, because if one of our arguments can be easily knocked down, then people will think, well, actually, how can I believe the rest of what you say if it's so easy to challenge one of the things that you say? Okay. So back to the disciplines of linguistics. So we may also hold the notion that actually we are available, you know, that languages are available to be studied at will, and this is one of the issues that I'm also struggling with at the moment. In a project that I'm involved with, the case studies were chosen. Sorry, there's a Freudian slip. Some case studies were chosen without consulting necessarily the communities who were involved. Hill has talked about this, that one of the rhetorics that was common about 20 years ago in promoting the idea, the awareness of endangered languages, language endangerment, was that languages are a common treasure of humankind, when actually, as Hill points out, people the communities where those languages have been used don't necessarily feel that other people have the right to come in and take them. Leonard has talked about not wanting to be data, to be mined. This is who wants to be mined? Who wants our languages to, Claire Bowen has talked about the linguist coming in, putting the language in a box and taking it away. So this, I think, is a problematic way of treating people and their languages. And the idea that languages can be delimited, reified, made into things, and analysed and counted is all perhaps, is tied up with the residue of colonial thinking about languages. And the notion that languages are dying, as I said, I think we have to think very carefully about whether linguistic diversity is actually under threat when the number of languages that we're counting is actually going up every year. We also assume as linguists that we know better than people from language communities. And then what we call folk linguistics, people's ideas, people's attitudes, people's ideologies about languages are irrelevant, when actually that is really important, because what drives people's language practices is what they learned from their childhood, what the ingrained ideologies. So this is the kind of thing that we need to challenge them. If what we teach what I teach, at least in my master's classes, particularly to my MA students, what's really important to me is learning to think critically. And this is something that we need to try to make more common. Is to challenge the ideologies that have been passed down to us. Okay, as I mentioned, like many members of the community, linguists often think that elders speak the purest version of the language. So I don't know if you've heard of this acronym, the NORM, the non-mobile older rural male, who is often the key informant for dialectological research. And as I said, often in my research, I found that actually some of the older people don't speak their languages very well, partly because, or largely because, they don't have anyone to speak to anymore. And so their languages are getting rusty. And also because of age-related problems as well, of course. Okay, and often as a discipline, when we think, if we have engaged with a more, let's say, progressive approach to research, we think, oh, we're going to give something back to the community. Though we often interpret that as providing a recording or a video, perhaps edited, of dances, songs, etc. Or often we produce a book of stories. But often we say, okay, when we say we're doing a book of stories, we're saying this is a book of stories for children. And we are actually then presenting traditional stories as something which is infantilized, something for children, and actually many traditional stories are not really very suitable for children. Kind of by, we have to think, okay, we have to treat people as adults. Yeah. Okay. And this is another quote from Hill, which I think is something we really need to take note of. A Native American person saying, "You white people have stolen every single thing we ever had, and now you're stealing our language." We do not have the right to steal languages. We do not have the right to document languages. We have to do that in collaboration with people if they allow us to. Okay. I think that we have to be careful, as I mentioned earlier, about discussing ideologies. Raising awareness is very difficult to do. Charlotte Hoffman pointed out that it actually can be political suicide to wash our dirty linen in public. For scholars, for people like us, it may be really important to raise awareness of intergroup fractures. There are very often splits in minority languages groups, and I have a kind of truism that the smaller the group, the larger the number of factions in that group quite often. And minority language people are like everybody. They don't always agree with each other. And we need to engage with that as well, because it took me 10 years to recognize the dynamics within a community that I thought I'd been brought up in and I thought I knew very well. So, it's very difficult to just parachute into a community and know what's going on in that community, which has been problematic for several of my PhD students, I have to say. So we need to pay attention to that, but at the same time, we have to retain the trust and cooperation of community members and revitalization activists. And it is quite often quite difficult to gain that trust. And then if you go and tell the whole world about splits in their communities, then they're not going to trust you much longer. Okay, but at the same time, we know that these ideologies and on the perceptions and the ideas that people hold can actually hinder the effectiveness of language revitalization movements. So I think we should not just discuss these things in academic forums such as this. We need to discuss these things with community members, but as I mentioned, it is quite difficult to raise. So I think we need to really get accepted by communities, to work with communities and for communities in order to start raising these things, because we do have an overview because people like people like me, I've been to various parts of the world, talked to people about around the world, found common issues arising around the world, and this is the kind of thing that we can say. We can raise, for example, how someone in another place has addressed such an issue. Okay, because people need to know that others are going through similar problems and struggles. I've noticed, first of all, when I started talking to people about language endangerment in Guernsey, I was told that they didn't know that there were other endangered languages. They thought they were going through this whole trauma of language loss on their own. So it was actually quite helpful to them to learn that they're actually most of the languages of the world are also in a similar situation, and that there are other people who have tried things and have some experience in this. So this is one of the things that we can do as external experts, if you like, is to make links between people in a similar situation. And this is not the only community who said that. Other communities and lots of communities don't know about language endangerment and language revitalization going on in other places around the world. Okay, so yeah, some ways we might approach this. So I don't know if you know Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's book, Decolonising Research. First written in 1999, I think a third edition was published in 2021. And it's not primarily about language, it is about our approaches to research, particularly about so-called empirical approaches to research. But she does cite Maori language revitalization as an example of how Indigenous people can reclaim their heritage. Because, as she says, it's rooted in traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge paradigms. And these are then used as methodologies in Maori-controlled schools and teaching methods, which is also combined with preschools. So they follow the kind of language nest model as they developed around the same time in parallel with Hawaii. These are not exactly close parts of the world, but yeah, similar languages and similar approaches. Okay, so I think then we also need to challenge the ideologies that I've been mentioning, the social roles and the power relationships embedded in these researcher versus so-called subject roles, people that we work with, participants, yeah, people from agents from from communities, okay, and the kind of narratives that we inherit as part of our disciplines, okay. So we also need to think about the theories by which we perceive, so-called understand and know the world, including languages, think about how our ways of thinking, our ontologies were developed and where we got them from, what we learned in our education and from our parents, and whether these actually stand up to comparison with what's actually happening in the world. And most importantly, we need to establish intellectual spaces for minoritized people to speak for themselves, in their own voices, and also to produce their own cultural discourses of philosophy, language, society, and economy. This is how I was trying not to be patronizing earlier. Yeah, it's very important for not just the languages, but also the voices to be heard. Okay. So Steger, back in 2003, also has a new edition of this book. It's a very readable, very short book about globalization. I highly recommend this book. Steger talks about two kinds of resistance that have been identified to globalization. This is all about globalization, but I think we can see a lot of parallels in endangered language revitalization movements. Okay, so the first of them is what he calls particularist protectionists, people who want to protect their own traditional ways of life, their own perceived distinctiveness. I think we can all recognize people like this, but people particularly who are more concerned with their own citizens than with the construction of a more equitable international order. So in English, we call this NIMBYism, not in my backyard. As I look out of the window now, I can see the route of a new high-speed train network, which various people along the route are protesting against. But it might be more effective to actually make links with other people doing that around the world. Okay, in terms of general environmental activism. So people who only think in terms of their own backyard may exclude or refuse to collaborate with other ethnic groups because what do they know about our language? This is a quote from someone in my own ethnic group who said this in a meeting about language revitalization. Okay, and then we can compare this with what Steger called universalist protectionists, who are not only necessarily concerned with a particular example, a particular ethnicity, a particular language, but are concerned with the environment in general, global warming, fair trade, human rights, etc. And these people tend to be more inclusive, more open to collaboration with other ethnic groups. And I think we can see this, we can see a development of this in language revitalization movements. So, for example, people in the Pacific, Maori, Hawaiian, and other language revitalization movements making common cause, working together, learning from each other. Other parts of the world, such as in the Celtic countries, in Europe, very often they learn from each other, particularly where the languages are similar, in the same language family as perceived by Western linguists. But I think more recently people have been opening up and learning from people on the other side of the world. We can actually use some of the products of globalization, such as social media, the internet, to find out what other people are doing in other parts of the world and to make links. And I think it is not always, because academics love to categorize things, to categorize people. Actually, the real world is not necessarily easy to categorize. So it's not always easy to differentiate between these kind of approaches, particularly when actually we can try to help nudge people from particularists towards universalists, particularly through making links, through making people aware of other things happening in other parts of the world and other places, other groups that they can collaborate with and learn from. Okay, so language revitalization is, of course, not just about language, as Hella has pointed out, actually not even about language at all, sensitive, because language can stand for many things. And in particular, it often is about struggles about power and empowerment, okay? And we can use this to the advantage of endangered language revitalization, because we can make these links because not everyone is interested in language. In many cases, people have more pressing concerns, making a living, the dam being built up the road, that kind of thing. But we need to, because people often associate endangered languages, minority languages with minoritization, with powerlessness, we have to stress the benefits that language revitalization can have and has been proven to have for minoritized people. So in Canada, there have been correlations made between the presence of a language revitalization program and reduction in youth suicide. In many places, youth suicide is actually one of the major causes of death in Indigenous communities, and other health problems as well. Basic health problems are often worse. Many health problems are worse in Indigenous communities, which is why people were very worried during COVID that minority languages, minority communities will be very badly hit. Okay, so for example, in Canada and Australia, there have been links made between language revitalization, being involved in language revitalization, and reduced rates of diabetes. Also in combating drug and alcohol addiction in many places. Again, because of the empowerment, the sense of self-fulfillment that can come from re-engaging with your community language, with your heritage, and yeah, that can actually, because it raises your self-esteem, then that can combat drug and alcohol addiction. Okay, Biddle and Swee have actually correlated happiness with learning traditional language and traditional activities, and in general, turning around their deficit ideologies that, as I said, we have to try and break the link between minoritization and powerlessness. Jeanette King in New Zealand, looking at people's motivations for being involved in language revitalization, has found people talking about not I'm revitalizing my language, but my language is revitalizing me. So not just saying, because most people are not actually that involved in we not everyone is a linguist. Linguists are very interested in language, but actually most people are not. So when we promote language revitalization, King is saying we should actually really focus on the benefits for people, not on the benefits for language. Okay. My colleague in Poland, Justyna Olko, has done a lot of research on the healing of historical trauma through language revitalization, because losing heritage languages has often been associated with the colonization process, and therefore in the deterioration of health and stress, etc., and elevated suicide risk, as I mentioned, in endangered languages communities. And there's been many studies that link the retention, the revitalization of Indigenous languages with the well-being of their speakers, and therefore they can act as a protective factor for psychological and physical health. And I think this is findings that we need to, like the benefits of multilingualism in general, we need to make these findings better known. So, for example, in North America and many other places, residential schools were used. Children were taken away from their parents in an attempt to eradicate the native languages and cultures. And we're finding increasingly evidence that there was abuse and neglect, and also many hundreds of deaths in these schools. And of course, this is a huge cause of trauma in Indigenous communities in these places. So this is an example of a teacher who is using language lessons to help heal the wounds from residential schools. So because languages were taken away in this process, bringing the languages back can also be a part of the process of healing from historical trauma. Okay, so yeah, so I think we can also decolonize and appropriate some of the trappings of modern life, because I'm not saying at all that we need to go back to some kind of mythical pre-contact past. That is not possible. We need to actually bring, as I said, bring our languages into the present, into the future. And that means using and appropriating things like social media and digital technologies, because we can use them to share experiences, we can use them to share expertise, to make links with people in other places, and in also the diaspora of our own communities, and also to create and share content, materials for and frameworks for teaching and learning minority languages. So we can use that to communicate and collaborate, for example, and also not just other Indigenous groups, but also with other minoritized groups. So in North America, for example, we see solidarity between Native Americans and activists of Black Lives Matter. And also currently with Palestine as well. As I mentioned, I think it's also important to demonstrate inclusivity and intersectionality so that we challenge genderized and racialized stereotypes, because as I mentioned, there are many stereotypes about Indigenous people. While challenging these stereotypes, we can also challenge other stereotypes as well, and welcome people of all genders and all ethnicities. Because we cannot make assumptions because just from how someone looks about what language they speak and how they're going to think. at the same time, we need to develop and valorize new speakers. We know, I'm not saying that we should not respect and valorize elders, because in many cases, and one of the reasons for language shift is that older speakers have never been given any respect for their expertise in their languages. So we need to recognize that expertise, involve them in language documentation, language revitalization. Things like master apprentice programs, I think, are a really good way of doing this, making links between older expert speakers and younger people, often mostly younger people who want to learn their heritage languages. And also recognize that younger speakers are the future of any language. And if we, but what often happens in language revitalization movements, we see this all around the world again and again. We see older speakers criticizing younger people who are trying to learn their languages. And that is actually one of the factors in language shift as well, because younger people will turn around and say, well, okay, you're criticizing the way I speak our language, but I speak the new language better than you, so I'm not going to bother to speak that old language anymore. And this is, again, I've seen this in many places. So we need to actually recognize that young people need to be allowed to pick up the ball of language and run with it and play with it and make it their own, because if they don't do that, then they are not going to use the language with their own families in future. Okay. One of the other things we can learn from, if you like, modern ways of thinking is communicative language teaching, student-centered language teaching, and also related to that, indigenous teaching methodologies, which perhaps teach language in a more naturalistic way, a way which is doesn't necessarily assume that you have to learn the structure of a language, that you have to learn linguistic paradigms before you can learn how to speak the actual language. We can start speaking with things like lexical chunks, with phrases, and also can learn from each other, rather than just kind of assuming that there is a Western traditional method of language teaching that has to be followed. Okay, and particularly I think ethnographic research is important here. Participatory research is important, but also learning from indigenous research paradigms, and everyone I think can learn from each other in this way. Okay, okay, getting to the end now, because as I mentioned earlier, the causes of language loss are embedded in colonization, in oppression, marginalization, and hegemony. I think, if people's repertoires of language are hierarchized and people are made to think that their way of doing things is less valid than another way of doing things, then that's going to lead to language shift. So what that means is that if we try to find solutions, so-called solutions such as teaching languages in school, that do not address the causes of language loss, then really we're not going to be very effective. If we try to avoid casting any blame, for example, if we believe that languages just go out of use and people stop speaking languages without any particular reason, then we're not really going to actually address the causes and actually find solutions. We also need to recognize that reversing language shift, as Fishman called it, cannot be based on acts of charity by outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean people like linguists or even governments. People often say, oh, well, we have to get our language recognized. We have to get our language taught in the school. We have to have a linguist to help us save our languages. And as I said, that takes away the agency from the people who actually are the core, the communities who really are the owners of all languages. Timothy Karetu, who's a key language activist in New Zealand, has also said that Indigenous peoples who might have lost their whole way of thinking have to get it back themselves. We cannot rely on other people. Governmental policies, it's great if a government is supportive, if there's funding from a government, but that can be taken away at the drop of a hat as well. Government policies can change all the time. We can't rely on them. We have to rely on bottom-up involvement, on community language use. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm going to go back to something that Gerald Roach said last year. How to save an endangered language and stop it from dying. First of all, realize that it's not the language that's endangered. It's not in danger necessarily. It's stigmatized, marginalized, and oppressed, and therefore that the term dying as a non-transitive verb is not very helpful. If we talk about language death, is often can be used. People it's often a negative term. People think, oh, our language is dead and we can't do anything about it. It's quite it can be predictive if as well as a description. So therefore, as he said, you stop trying to save just the language. You have to fight the oppression of the speakers, and empowering people is going to including language in empowerment is I think the way forward. And that's about it. This is my list of references. If you want a copy of this, just let me know. There will be a recording, and we will be sending that. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. We've got about half an hour, I think, if we want to have some questions. I think I'm just going to stop sharing my slides and allow people to talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Julia. Alia, raise your hand. Okay, so this is, I'm sorry, there's too many people raising hands at the same time. So if you have questions or comments, please use the button down there to raise your hand. Alia, Army.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. And thank you to the organizers. This was a really fantastic overview of the field, and you did quite justice to that. I have some questions, really probing ones.
I'm sure you do.
And I'm kind of like thinking about several things which you've said, but I will stick to just one aspect, which is that you said that academics like to categorize. And I mean, that has probably been the main colonial linguistics, at least in the South Asian context, which I'm more familiar with. And minority-majority binaries, in my opinion, don't really work all the time in that context, at least. And it is because some of those languages are actually mutually understandable. For instance, think about Hindi and Urdu. And those language categories and also the statistics really don't map to actually what's happening even now in those contexts. And the second thing I want to mention is that you mentioned that you are invited from many different parts of the world. And what stuck to me was India and Pakistan and other contexts. And as a person of color, since you mentioned color and race as well, I was thinking about Spivak, who says that women of color, and I would say that even in academia, probably sometimes are at the lower end of the hierarchies. So it's also my positionality, which I want to bring into this question, is that I see a lot of problematic description of South Asian language and linguistic practices, which kind of don't match to what revitalization efforts do. And I sometimes actually find them dividing and ruling again the revitalization. So would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think actually what you're saying is not contradictory to what I was trying to say. I don't know if I was very effective in what I was trying to say. I do agree with you totally that it is often divide and rule, that we're dividing up languages artificially, that the linguistic descriptions don't necessarily fit people's practices. This is the problem of categorization. I totally agree with you about representation as well. This is why I have felt quite uncomfortable in some cases. And I have said this to people organizing conferences, that, you know, who am I to say this? But yeah, people don't always listen to me. Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think, as I said, there's not really a contradiction here. We need to try to raise awareness of just kind of different ways of thinking, and challenge hierarchies. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's move on. There are 9 messages I can see in the chat. Sumitra, maybe you could be chair here, and yeah, choose who's going to speak.
There's one question from the from the chat room. So how do climate change and other forms of ecological threats put language at risk? Yeah, from John. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there can be, of course, very real physical challenge, very dangers from climate change in terms of increased extreme weather events, actually wiping out communities. Communities are often forced to move both by climate change events, but also by top-down efforts to promote things like so-called sustainable energy. So, for example, like building dams often forces indigenous communities to move, and therefore to assimilate and to lose their ways of life and their traditional lands. There's a lot of I mean, I don't want to be essential. I don't want to sort of be exoticize traditional knowledge, but there is a lot of traditional knowledge of land management, for example, of more sustainable practices in terms of agriculture, etc., which could be very valuable. This is the kind of thing that Wesley Leonard was saying, that you know, we assume that we're only just discovering this now. Actually, this has been the case for a long time, but people haven't taken notice of traditional ways of agriculture and land management, rewilding, for example, challenging the monolithic agro business model of food production, which is now the dominant one. And you know, I think it's the ways of thinking, the monolithic ways of thinking, the monoculturalism, the monolingualism, the monocrops, if you like, of, you know, they're all kind of similar ways of thinking. Yeah, and I think all these ways of thinking have similar roots in colonialized thinking, and assumptions that so-called modern, meaning westernized, ways of doing things are somehow progress. Yeah, so yeah, lots of things to be learned, I think. I'm not saying that we have to go back to pre-contact ways of living. There are lots of things from modern medicine, for example, which have been quite beneficial, but these things need to be shared on a much more equitable basis, and also knowledge needs to be shared on a more equitable basis, which means taking notice of people who have not had a voice on you know, until now, about how to do things. I don't know if that's helpful. Okay. I'm finding it difficult to read what's in the chat, I'm afraid. Okay, let's see if I can find. Okay. Oh, here we are. Okay, and there are lots and lots of questions here and comments.
Okay, I will read one more question. So, can you say more about the role of literacy in reversing indigenous language loss? Given what you said about valorizing indigenous teaching methodologies, often outside the formal context of schools or government LP pronouncements.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying literacy is a bad thing. Obviously, we need literacy. we need to also promote literacy in home languages as well, because that has been shown to improve educational outcomes. But we also need to recognize that the kind of approach to education that has been done so far, the colonized view of education has often in the past been educate people only to the extent that is necessary for them to be productive members of that society and to stay in their place. I think I mentioned the need to teach critical thinking. I think that's a really important thing to include in education. But also literacy is often imposed in a top-down way. A writing system for a community may be imposed by a government when it's not actually something that is recognized by the community at all. Non-standard ways of writing, of spelling a particular language are often not recognized. When writing systems are developed, what we could often do, we could actually look at what people are doing in social media. People are often writing things like poetry in minority languages as a way of expressing their identities, and often these kind of bottom-up crowdsourced ways of writing are not necessarily taken any notice of. And I think when we, meaning linguists and government agencies, develop writing system, I think again it's the whole theme I'm trying to say here is take much more notice of bottom-up practices and use this as an opportunity to empower people rather than to put them in their place, if you like, to limit their choices. So we need to widen choices rather than limiting them, and that includes literacy activity. So what often happens with, particularly in what we might call fourth world examples of language revitalization, is that the language becomes part of the dominant school system and is taught in a way that's the same as other subjects in school, as something that is a school subject. So that, for example, even in somewhere like Wales, where the language is often is actually the medium of education in many schools, children learn to talk about things like science, geography, etc. in their language, but they don't learn to say things like "I love you, let's make a baby and speak our language to it." So children find that we're finding kind of domain shifts. So the language, again, this is a kind of dominant approach to what language should do. People assume that a minority language has to be like a dominant language. You have to have prestige ways of writing, etc. You have to focus on education. And forgetting what Fishman said about using the language in the community first and foremost, so that there is a community to speak the language with when you leave school. Yeah, because as I said before, the language needs to leave school, not just be like confined. It's another way of confining the language to a particular, putting it in a box, putting it in the education box, rather than using it in the wider community. Okay, rant over.
Okay, we have John. Yeah.
Yeah, John, get your hand up.
Yes. Good evening, Dr. Julia. Thank you for the talk. By the way, I'm John Ray from the Philippines. The ideas of language revitalization, language reclamation, and language documentation actually overlap. Could you distinguish the differences among these concepts for the sake of those who are novices in this field of or area of research interest? Thank you.
You're asking me to categorize things again, aren't you? As you say, there are overlaps. When, for example, when we document, the way I do language documentation is not the same way that many linguists do. So I don't just go and say, how do you say this? How do you say that? Because I've often found that people don't give me what I know is the actual answer. People are often giving them a more prestige way of saying something in a diglossic situation. So, for example, in my own community in Guernsey, traditionally, the high language was French. French was the language of education. Whereas Genezier was seen as a poor relation. Nowadays, people are trying to promote Genezier as something separate, that is a cousin of French rather than a dialect of French. So when I went with some of my students and they took a bit more traditional approach and said, oh, how do you say this? How do you say pig? This was the example. And the guy we were talking to, who was really what some linguists would call a semi-speaker, what I prefer to call a latent speaker, so hadn't had the chance to develop his language skills very much. He said, porc, which is the French for pig. And I happen to know that we say pusher rather than that. So I told a little story about a pig using the word pusher rather than correcting him, and he said, "Oh yes, I meant to say pusher." But what I normally do instead of that is just to talk to people when I'm documenting. I take a much more ethnographic approach, or what linguists often call a monolingual approach. So getting people to talk about their general lives, or perhaps we agree a topic or something, so that we get language in use, language in conversation, which is something that actually is often missing from the products of language documentation. People often document things like paradigms. People often document traditional events or ceremonies or recitations of poetry, etc., rather than actual language in use. And people often find when they're trying to revitalize language that there isn't very useful language in the record. Because the people have forgotten to document things like greetings and apologies and functional uses of language, of child rearing language, for example, how to tell your child off, how to tell them to go to the toilet, etc. These things are often not documented. Okay, is that helpful?
We have a question from the chat room from Ernie Ati from Indonesia. Who is working on a dissertation on the revitalization of the Lun language in Indonesia. So is there any suggestions that you could provide? The question is basically how to revitalize the language. And the active speakers are only aged 50 years and over.
Yes, indeed. Well, gosh, I can't do that in 2 seconds. I would suggest that you look at what people have done in other situations. There is a fair amount of literature on language revitalization. If I may do a little promotion, I have a book called Revitalizing Indigenous Languages, a practical guide, which Justina Olko and I edited a couple of years ago. And it's available on open access for free, paid for by the wonderful European Union. So perhaps you might have a look at that, because it will give you kind of a kind of an insight, but also an overview of what people are doing around the world, because many of the examples are written by people from language communities. So I mean, in my community as well, active speakers are not only aged over 50, they're 80 and 90 really years old. And in many language communities, it's like I mentioned, it's people who maybe have heard the language when they were young but didn't learn to speak it properly, or who heard a few words when they were young, like I did, are trying to relearn their language, reclaim their language. I think really what I mentioned, the Master Apprentice Program approach. It's basically you're putting in touch people who want to learn the language with more fluent speakers of the language, making links between the older and the younger members of the community. I would suggest that would be the first place to start, would be to re-establish the intergenerational links between the older fluent speakers, to valorize them, but also to help the younger people. Because in a Master Apprentice approach, very often the older people, as I mentioned, don't have anybody to speak to. The people of their generation are dying. I talked to an old man who said he hadn't had anyone to speak to since his mother died 9 years before. So if we can put them in touch with younger people who can also help them around the house, because often older people don't get out very much. They don't have a chance to talk to younger people. I think this can benefit everybody. So I would say look at that kind of approach first, and then only later, when people have started to speak a little bit, then perhaps think about literacy and schools and so on.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Ben. So the question is there any experience in implementing language revitalization in countries with political systems different from those you have named, for example, China, Vietnam?
Sorry, I can't say. Can you say that again? Sorry.
Okay. Is there any experience?
Yes, I see the comment now.
Yeah.
Experience in implementing it, yes. Well, Gerald Roach has worked in China in particular, in Xinjiang province. And I actually have one of our former MA students, now a PhD student, I think in Catalonia. He has been working with people in Vietnam. I know that it's difficult to implement bottom-up movements in such places. But actually, some people have said things like, if you want to save a language, actually you have to ban it. And there is some truth in the fact that if you ban something, people can resist that oppression, and resistance to oppression is often the root of many language revitalization movements. It can be dangerous, but this happened in Spain under General Franco. There was a fascist regime from after the Civil War in the 1930s until the 1970s, and that was when many of the language revitalization movements, particularly in the Basque Ikastolak Basque medium schools, started in that period, and now they are officialized. Now they're recognized, but they very much had their roots in that period where speaking the language was banned, but people did it in secret, and people did it in their families. Please, I mean, don't put anyone in danger. We are privileged because we can travel, we can say these things and this is how we can help, if you like, by raising awareness from our position of privilege. Yeah. So
Okay.
I see that Peter Austin has very helpfully shared the link to the free download of our book in the chat as well, if you're interested. Thank you, Peter.
Okay. Do we have any more comments and questions?
Joseph Solis.
The Philippines.
There's a comment here, but the biggest hurdle is intergenerational poverty. Yes, poverty is often associated with multilingualism. Again, Indigenous languages other than Tagalog aren't standardized, more practical to teach foreign languages aimed at Spanish. Efforts to standardize Indigenous languages by linguists face resistance by native speakers themselves. We don't have to standardize languages for people. I think that the message I'm trying to put across is standardization is it is necessary if you want to go an education route, but an education route is not the primary route for language revitalization. It depends on what and teaching languages in schools isn't necessarily going to make people fluent. You have to understand that very few people become fluent from learning a language in school. You become fluent by using a language. And as I mentioned to the person from Indonesia, try to speak the languages first. Put younger people in touch with older people. Start using your language in the community to each other. The most important thing is to speak the language. Also think about the ideological clarification. What do we want? What is our aim? What are our short-term, medium-term, long-term aims? And does what we actually do actually contribute to achieving those aims? So if we're aiming to bring our language back as a language of the community, then what we need to do is speak it. If we want to put our languages into the school, yes, we need to develop standardized teaching materials, but we have to remember that that is not necessarily going to bring the language back into the community. Okay.
Yeah, in fact, we're going to have a speaker, Professor Adriana, who actually will talk on that particular topic
Okay.
relevant to just
Oh.
what we just said. Yes. Okay.
Great, thank you.
And it's probably in April. I mean, I'll keep all of you posted on the new, I mean, on this WUN webinar series. Yeah. Okay. Is there, oh yeah. Okay. From Elwin, a lot of work and methodologies were designed and developed by Western Northern linguistics in indigenous languages around the world. Would these methodologies succeed in the revitalization of European languages? For example, Rise Up project.
Okay. Sorry, can you
basically, like, would methodologies designed and developed by Western or Northern linguistics work with European languages?
It depends which kind of which methodologies you're talking about. I mentioned earlier about what was called communicative language teaching, which was developed in the 1980s, which has made language learning less deadly, less boring for a whole generation of students. I think that is more appropriate, perhaps, although we have to also recognize that the aims of language teaching for minority language may not be the same. We know that our language cannot compete on the global stage. It's never going to be as big as English or Arabic or Chinese. So we need to think about what we actually want to use our language for, and let that perhaps dictate the teaching methods that we develop. And also, as I said, remember that there have been traditional ways of teaching and learning languages. And I remember talking to a politician in Guernsey about this. He's saying, "But our language is not written. How can we learn it?" And I said, "Well, how did you learn your first language?" Oh, he says, "Okay, yeah, by talking to people, yeah." Yeah, it's also a myth that adults can't learn languages. I started learning my heritage language at the age of 40, and I'm now probably the youngest fluentish female, proficient, I would say, fluent female speaker. There are many examples of older people learning languages effectively. And I think actually I've written a paper challenging the notion that we have to actually pass it to children, because very often in language revitalization movements, adults who are learning languages with and from each other, not necessarily teaching it through schools at all.
Okay. We have another question from Nelmar. Is there a possibility of applying pedagogical translanguaging in teaching to combat language attrition?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Translanguaging is a recent development in approaches to language mixing. There are a couple of different views on this with regard to endangered language revitalization, because we need to valorize how people actually use language. And if you are multilingual, you will normally mix your language naturally. And you can't prevent people doing this. It is a normal way of using language. Again, it challenges the traditional monolingual view of how people should use languages. But for people teaching endangered languages, some people see this as a challenge because they're mixing it with a majority language, and they see that as another imposition of language shift. Yeah, I think, to take into account how people feel about this. Many people have purist views about language. They think that language change is bad and that language mixing leads to language change and therefore to language decline. But actually, you have to say, okay, these young people are at least using some of their traditional language. This is better than none. If you tell them off for using their language in a particular way, for mixing languages, as I said, they're going to turn around and say, "Oh, well, I won't use it at all because I speak the new language better." So don't put people down for using language. Accept this and valorize how people speak, but also perhaps point out how the languages are different, perhaps, and how one might say certain things in the language, but do it in a respectful and sensitive way. Okay, I need to go very shortly, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Yeah, we're
Okay.
pretty much at the end of our 2 hours.
Yes. And so thank you so much for all the comments and thank you Julia for your
Okay, thank you so much.
thought-provoking presentation. Yeah. And so thank you all of you for joining us today for this exploration of decolonizing language revitalization. And I hope that the discussion has sparked some critical thinking and inspire you to consider these important issues. So as we wrap up, I want to reiterate the crucial role that each of you plays in supporting endangered and marginalized languages, whether you are a linguist, educator, community member, or simply someone who values linguistic diversity. Your actions can contribute to a more equitable future for these languages and their communities. And so this webinar marks the first session in our exciting series focusing on awareness raising by Professor Julia Salabank. And we look forward to welcoming new speakers and delving deeper into various aspects of language revitalization in the coming weeks and months. The next talk would be in April. And so for the latest updates on upcoming webinars and additional resources, you can visit RILCA website. I put a link in the chat room. And so RILCA website or Facebook and all, the Language Revival Center at RILCA and also wun.ac.uk. And thank you once again for your time and participation. We encourage you to share your thoughts and continue the conversation on decolonizing language revitalization. So until next time, take care and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the organization and to everybody who has taken part and for your very interesting comments and questions.